Welcome everybody. I want to again thank Chanoch Ari for coming by. And last week I wasn't available. I was actually in Eretz Yisrael, first time in a long time, in exactly a year. And I traveled there because it was my mother's first yahrzeit. My mother passed away exactly a year ago from Thursday, which was the 22nd day of Cheshvan. It was November 8th on the English calendar. And my mother, interestingly enough, passed away 23 years after my father, Zchreinu Levracha. And on the same day, Chaf Beis Cheshvan, we had yahrzeit that day. And it was we felt it was kind of appropriate. Everything's been Hashemayim. Two of them who were a wonderful couple together and very close. As you see, my mother for 23 years didn't get remarried, didn't even think about it. Every day she only spoke about my father. That was every day, no matter what your conversation was, somehow it ended with an antidote, something about daddy. So we went for the yahrzeit. I want to share with you a thought and an idea that's kind of based on last week's parsha, but also is appropriate for this week's parsha. This week's parsha is Parshas Toldos, and begins to tell us the story of the generations of the creation, really, of the Bnei Yisrael, as Yitzchak and Rivka give birth to Yaakov and Esav, and from Yaakov comes our lineage, Ki Yitzchak Yikar L'Chazara. And the Torah talks about Toldos is the name of the parsha, and it's a parsha really of raising children, raising different children, two extremely opposite children. And the concept of Chanoich L'Nar Al Pi Darkoi, and it's complicated and it's difficult, and Avraham and Rivka and Yitzchak and their different approach, but still the concept of, as parents, us being challenged to raise children. And I want to share with you a Ramban from last week's parsha. Actually, I said this at my mother's levaya a year ago, but it rings true to me today as much as it did then. So in last week's parsha, Avraham Avinu comes back from the Akedah, and like the Torah tells us in the previous parsha, one before that, after the Akedah, Avraham returned to Be'er Sheva. And Rashi points out that he didn't live in Be'er Sheva. That wasn't his hometown anymore. He'd lived there for many years, but he had moved to Hebron. And we see by Chayei Sarah that Sarah Imenu was in Hebron and she died in Hebron. And the Torah tells us in last week's parsha, Vayovay Avram lispaid l'Sarah. Avram came for the funeral of Sarah and to arrange her burial. And Rashi says, Vayovay Avram, he came from where? He came from Be'er Sheva. What was he doing in Be'er Sheva? Well, after the Akedah, he went to Be'er Sheva. And that's the question. Why did he go to Be'er Sheva after the Akedah? Rashi says he definitely didn't go back to live there. He wasn't living there. He just went there. Rashi doesn't tell us why. The Ramban, in a lengthy discussion back and forth, but the Ramban says the following, that after the Akedah, Avram returned to Be'er Sheva. That was his Eshel. That was where he had his headquarters. He had set up what we know as the Eshel of Avram, Achila, Shesia, Levia, the place of Eshel, also the words of Sho'al. You can ask for whatever you want there, and Avram would provide it for you. And that was his home. And he went there. The Ramban says, I'll read you the words. The Ramban says, I will halach tchila el Be'er Sheva, makom ha'eshel shalei, the place where he had once previously set up his eshel, laseis hoida al nisai, to praise, to give hoda, to give gratitude and thanks on the miracle that he had experienced. The question is, what miracle are we talking about? What's the miracle that he has just experienced? Is it the miracle of the Akedah, that Yitzchak was almost, and he didn't die? I mean, I don't know why that's a miracle. It's what the Rabbeinu Shalom set out to do. And if it is so, that's the miracle. So let him give the Birchas Hanes. This is a Hida al Nisai, right? The Hida al Nisai. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech ha'olam, she'asa li nes b'makom hazeh. Right? So that should be said at Har Moriah, at the Akedah. Why would he travel all the way to Be'er Sheva, go all the way down to the south of Eretz Yisrael when he's in Yerushalayim, he's in the north, and he has to go home to Hebron? He passes through Hebron and goes all the way down to Be'er Sheva to give L'Hodos Al Nisai. It's the Nes of the Akedah. So I said then that, from the Akedah, Avram came to to the recognition, and he saw with his own eyes that his son Yitzchak, who he had raised together with his wife Sarah, they had raised him properly, and that their chinuch, and that they had the siyata d'shmaya that Yitzchak should turn out to who he became. And it's always a question, how is a child going to turn out? Is he going to get everything that he needs to be successful in life, to have the right approach and perspective and priorities? And the Akedah was that telltale moment, that statement, that declaration from Yitzchak and his willingness to sacrifice and to give everything for the Rebbeinu Shalom. That was the declaration, the demonstration that Yitzchak says, I've arrived. And Avram came to see from that Yitzchak would now become who he needed to become. So he went to give Haidah, listen to this, Al Nisai. Number one, he recognizes that it's a miracle. It's an outright miracle that you're able to raise a child. This is in the times of Avram. We talk about how difficult it is to raise children today and all the challenges and all the distractions and everything that goes on in our world. But Avram Avinu understood way back then that raising a child in the proper and instilling in the child the proper chinuch that takes and that needs a miracle. And he went to the place where that miracle occurred. Not where he found out about the miracle. He found out about the miracle at the Akedah. But the miracle that occurred in the home where Yitzchak was raised, all of those years that he spent, most of his life, the majority of Yitzchak's life, he was born and raised in Beersheva, in the Eshel, under the guidance of Avram, which said day in and day out, we live for others, we live for the Rebbeinu Shalom. Everything that we do is for strangers, to teach them, to give them, to provide for them, to care for them. That's what the Eshel represented. So Avram went back to Beersheva, to that Eshel, and he said, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech ha'olam she'asa li nes b'makom hazeh, that you have performed a miracle for me here in this place. What's the miracle? That Yitzchak is who he is, and that he was raised. And that Eshel has stayed as our tradition of who we are, and stayed with us. My emotion then at the funeral of my mother was that we as children who were raised in an Eshel, in Borough Park, in a small corner where my father did his best impression of Avram Avinu, opening our home to complete and absolute strangers, taking them in and making them part of our family. It's a long talk, and I've talked a lot about it in the shul. If you come around, you know this. But, we are grateful as children to having been exposed to the kind of home that my parents exposed us to, and that we can teach that to our children. But as we move now into this parsha, Esav and Yaakov being raised, and all about children, raising children needs a miracle. And it's a miracle that we need to be mispalel to the Rebbeinu Shalom day in and day out, and be consciously aware and cognizant of every word that we talk to our children. And we should be zeicha to see that miracle of our children growing, developing with happiness and simcha and ahava and a ratzon and a true willingness and a desire to be erlich Yidden who care about other Jews and who dedicate their lives to the development of the harmony of a dveikus with the Rebbeinu Shalom of body and soul. And we should be zeicha to see that nace. Thank you for listening.